They rolled their eyes every time I adjusted the volume, whispered behind my back about how embarrassing it was to be seen with me, and treated me like I was already halfway to the grave. Little did they know, I heard every cruel word they thought I missed, and when my attorney read my final will aloud in that mahogany-paneled conference room, their faces went white as they realized I had been listening all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and at 73 years old, I had built something most people only dream of. Whitmore Industries started as a small textile company in 1952, when my late husband Charles and I pooled our savings and bought a failing fabric mill in Riverside, Connecticut. Over 5 decades, we transformed that struggling operation into a manufacturing empire worth $47 million. With facilities across 3 states and over 800 employees who depended on us for their livelihoods. Charles passed away 4 years ago, leaving me as the sole owner and CEO of everything we had built together. The hearing loss came gradually after that, a combination of age and years spent in noisy factory environments. By the time I finally accepted that I needed assistance, my hearing had deteriorated significantly. The audiologist, Dr. Patricia Newman, fitted me with a top-of-the-line digital hearing aid that restored most of my hearing capacity. But it came with an unfortunate side effect. In quiet environments, I sometimes needed to adjust the volume higher than most people found comfortable. That small accommodation became the weapon my family used against me. It started with my daughter-in-law, Victoria Whitmore, who had married my son Robert 15 years earlier. Victoria was a former beauty queen from Atlanta who had never worked a day in her life, but she had very definite opinions about how other people should live theirs. She was 42 years old, blonde, perfectly manicured, and had the kind of southern charm that could disarm most people within minutes of meeting her. What took longer to discover was the calculating mind behind that sweet smile. Robert, my eldest at 48, had always been somewhat weak-willed, easily influenced by whoever spoke to him last. He was competent enough at his job as regional sales manager for our company, but he lacked the vision and drive that had built Whitmore Industries. My younger son, Michael, was 39 and worked as our head of operations. Unlike his brother, Michael was sharp, ambitious, and had a mind for business that reminded me of Charles in his younger days. He was married to Sarah, a lovely woman who worked as a pediatric nurse and had given me 2 beautiful granddaughters, Emma and Sophie. The trouble began 6 months ago during our monthly family dinner at my home in Riverside Heights, the same colonial mansion where Charles and I had raised our boys. These dinners had been a tradition since Charles died, a way to keep the family connected despite our busy schedules. I had hired Mrs. Garcia, a wonderful housekeeper and cook, to help me maintain the large house, but I still insisted on setting the table myself and ensuring everything was perfect for our gatherings. That particular evening in March, the conversation had turned to business, as it often did. I was explaining some concerns I had about our quarterly projections when Victoria interrupted me with a theatrical sigh. "Eleanor, sweetheart, your hearing aid is so loud it's giving me a headache," she said, pressing her fingers to her temples dramatically. "Could you please turn it down?" I glanced around the table, noting that no one else seemed bothered by any noise, but I reached up and lowered the volume slightly. The conversation continued, but I found myself struggling to follow the discussion clearly. When I asked Robert to repeat something he had said about the Detroit facility, Victoria rolled her eyes and exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she murmured to Robert, though her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "She can't even follow a simple conversation anymore." The comment stung, but I chose to ignore it. Victoria had always been prone to dramatic pronouncements, and I had learned over the years that responding only encouraged more attention-seeking behavior. However, what I noticed next was far more troubling. Throughout the remainder of the evening, every time I adjusted my hearing aid or asked someone to speak up, Victoria would make small comments to Robert about my, quote, condition, or my confusion. By the time everyone left that night, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I had been observed and evaluated, rather than simply enjoying dinner with my family. The sensation lingered long after their cars pulled out of my circular driveway. The next incident occurred 2 weeks later, during our monthly board meeting at the Whitmore Industries headquarters. Our boardroom was an impressive space with a long oak table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Connecticut River. The meeting included myself as CEO, Robert and Michael as department heads, our CFO Janet Morrison, our legal counsel David Chen, and our head of manufacturing Tom Bradley. These meetings were typically professional affairs where we reviewed financials, discussed operational issues, and planned for the future. About halfway through the meeting, my hearing aid began to emit a slight feedback sound, probably due to the way I was positioned relative to the microphone system we used for recording minutes. I discreetly reached up to adjust it, but the brief whistle was audible to everyone in the room. "Mother," Robert said, his voice carrying a tone of embarrassment I had never heard before. "Perhaps you should step out and fix that? It's very distracting." The entire room fell silent. In 47 years of running this company, no one had ever suggested that I leave my own boardroom to accommodate them. The other board members looked uncomfortable, clearly unsure how to respond to this unprecedented moment. "The adjustment takes 2 seconds, Robert," I replied evenly, finishing the volume correction. Now, where were we with the Hartford expansion proposal? But the damage was done. For the remainder of the meeting, I noticed people speaking more slowly and loudly when addressing me, as if I were incapable of understanding complex business concepts rather than simply needing audio assistance. Janet Morrison, who had worked with me for 12 years and knew perfectly well that my mind was as sharp as ever, began explaining financial reports in overly simplified terms. After the meeting, I overheard Victoria talking to Robert in the hallway outside my office. She had come to pick him up for lunch, an unusual occurrence since she rarely visited the office. "Honey, you can't let her embarrass herself like that in front of the board," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying that sweet, concerned tone she used when she wanted to sound caring while delivering criticism. "People are going to start questioning whether she's still competent to run this company. Maybe it's time to talk to her about stepping back from some of her responsibilities." "I don't know, Vic," Robert replied, sounding uncertain. "She still seems pretty sharp to me." "Robert, sweetheart, she couldn't even manage her hearing aid properly in a professional meeting. What happens when she makes a mistake that costs the company money? Or worse, what if she has an accident because she can't hear properly? You and Michael need to think about protecting your inheritance before she makes decisions that could hurt the business." My inheritance. The words hit me like a physical blow. For the first time, I understood that this was not about concern for my well-being, or even embarrassment about my hearing aid. This was about money and control. I quietly closed my office door and sat behind the mahogany desk, where I had made thousands of decisions over the decades. The preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Same desk where Charles and I had planned our expansion into manufacturing, where we had weathered economic downturns, where we had celebrated our biggest contracts and mourned our most painful losses. Now I was sitting there realizing that my own family was plotting against me. That evening, I called Dr. Newman and scheduled an appointment to have my hearing aid recalibrated. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because I needed to understand exactly what others were hearing and how I could minimize any disruption, while still maintaining my ability to participate fully in conversations. Dr. Newman was a kind woman in her 50s who had been treating hearing loss patients for over 20 years. When I explained the situations I had encountered, her expression grew serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing sounds like a family dynamic issue rather than a technical problem with your device," she said carefully. "Your hearing aid is functioning perfectly, and the volume levels you're using are completely appropriate for your degree of hearing loss. Some people are simply less tolerant of the sounds associated with hearing assistance devices." "But am I causing a genuine disruption?" I asked. "Am I being inconsiderate?" Dr. Newman shook her head firmly. "You have every right to hear clearly in your own meetings and your own home. The adjustments you're making are normal and necessary. Anyone who objects to you managing your hearing aid is essentially objecting to you accommodating your disability, which is both unreasonable and potentially discriminatory." Her words provided some comfort, but they also confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Victoria was not simply annoyed by the sound of my hearing aid. She was using it as a tool to paint me as incompetent and burdensome. Over the following weeks, I began to pay closer attention to the dynamics during family gatherings and business meetings. What I discovered was a pattern of subtle but persistent undermining that was far more sophisticated than simple complaints about volume levels. During our April family dinner, Victoria had arrived early and spent time talking privately with Michael and Sarah before the meal began. When we all sat down together, I noticed that both my daughter-in-law Sarah and even my granddaughters seemed to be watching me more carefully than usual. Every time I reached for my hearing aid, I caught them exchanging glances. Midway through dinner, 8-year-old Emma asked me a question about school, but she spoke very quietly, as children sometimes do. I asked her to repeat herself, and she did, but again in a whisper. "Emma, sweetheart, speak up so grandmother can hear you," Sarah said gently. "But Mommy," Emma replied in her innocent voice, "Aunt Victoria said we should talk quietly so grandmother's ear thing doesn't hurt us." The table went silent. Sarah's face turned red as she realized what her daughter had just revealed. Victoria had been coaching my granddaughters to speak in ways that would make me struggle to hear them, creating situations where I would appear confused or inattentive. "Victoria," I said carefully, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me, "did you tell the girls that my hearing aid would hurt them?" Victoria's southern charm went into overdrive immediately. "Oh, Eleanor, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I just mentioned to the girls that sometimes electronic devices can make loud sounds that might startle them. I was trying to be considerate of everyone's comfort." It was a masterful deflection, turning her manipulation into apparent thoughtfulness. But I had heard what I heard, and more importantly, I was beginning to see the pattern. After dinner, I asked Michael to stay behind while the others left. Of all my children, Michael had always been the most direct and honest, qualities I had tried to instill in both my sons, but which had taken root more firmly in my younger child. "Michael, I need to ask you something and I want you to give me a straight answer," I said as we sat in my study. "Do you think I'm becoming incompetent?" Michael looked genuinely surprised by the question. "What? Mom, no. Why would you ask that?" "Because Victoria seems to think I am, and she appears to be working hard to convince others of that as well." My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, I think Victoria is just concerned about you living alone in this big house. And maybe she's worried about some of the business decisions you've been making lately." "What business decisions concern her, exactly? She's never shown any interest in Whitmore Industries before." Michael hesitated, and I could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke. "She mentioned that you've been talking about some major changes to the company structure. Something about charitable foundations and legacy planning. Robert told her you've been meeting with lawyers about restructuring your will. There it was. The real issue was not my hearing aid or my competence. The real issue was that I had been quietly working with David Chen and a estate planning specialist to establish a charitable foundation that would benefit from a significant portion of my estate. Not all of it, but enough to fund scholarships for underprivileged students and support programs for workers transitioning out of manufacturing jobs. I had not discussed these plans with my family yet because they were still in the early stages. But somehow Victoria had learned about them. More importantly, she clearly saw them as a threat to what she considered her rightful inheritance through Robert. "Michael," I said slowly, "has anyone in this family asked me directly about my estate plans? Has anyone expressed interest in understanding my wishes or my reasoning?" He looked ashamed. "No, Mom. We all just assumed that everything would be split between Robert and me, the way Dad always talked about. Your father died 4 years ago, son. A lot has changed since then, including my perspective on what it means to leave a meaningful legacy. But the important thing is that these are my decisions to make, and I'm fully capable of making them." Michael nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Whether that concern was for me or for his potential inheritance, I was no longer certain. That night, I made 2 important decisions. First, I was going to accelerate my estate planning process and make sure my wishes were documented clearly and legally. Second, I was going to be much more careful about who I trusted with information about my personal affairs. I called David Chen the next morning and scheduled a comprehensive meeting to finalize my will and establish the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Educational Opportunity. I also asked him to recommend a private investigator who could help me understand exactly what my family knew about my finances and how they had obtained that information. The private investigator, Maria Santos, was a former police detective who specialized in corporate and family investigations. When I met with her the following week, I explained my concerns about information leaks and potential manipulation within my own family. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than most people realize," Maria told me. "Adult children who believe they're entitled to their parents' wealth sometimes engage in elaborate campaigns to prove that their parent is incompetent, especially if they suspect the inheritance might be distributed differently than they expect. But my family wouldn't go that far, would they? This is about a hearing aid and some business meetings." Maria's expression was grave. "Ma'am, I've seen families destroy each other over far less money than what's at stake here. If someone believes that millions of dollars are slipping away from them, they're capable of almost anything to protect what they see as rightfully theirs." She recommended that I be extremely careful about what information I shared and with whom. She also suggested that I consider installing discrete security cameras in my home and office to document any unusual behavior or conversations. "The most important thing," Maria advised, "is to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if people are treating you differently because of your hearing aid, document everything." Discrimination against people with disabilities can be a powerful legal issue if it comes to that. As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that what had started as annoyance about a hearing aid had revealed something much darker about my family dynamics. Victoria was not just a difficult daughter-in-law. She was someone who saw me as an obstacle to be removed, and she was apparently willing to use my disability as a weapon against me. The question now was how far she was willing to go, and whether my sons would stand with me or against me when the truth finally came to light. Over the next month, I quietly implemented Maria's recommendations while maintaining my normal routines. The security cameras were installed discreetly by a company that specialized in protecting elderly clients from caregiver abuse. I began keeping detailed notes about family interactions and business meetings, recording dates, times, and specific comments that seemed designed to portray me as incompetent. What I discovered was both more extensive and more insidious than I had imagined. The cameras in my home revealed that Victoria had been arriving early for family dinners and walking through my house, opening drawers, examining papers on my desk, and even going through my mail. During one particularly brazen episode, she had photographed documents in my study with her phone, including correspondence from David Chen about the foundation planning. More disturbing was what I overheard during these visits. Victoria had developed a habit of calling Robert from my kitchen while I was supposedly resting upstairs, though my hearing aid allowed me to pick up her conversations clearly. "The old woman is definitely losing it," I heard her say during one such call in late May. "She left the stove on again yesterday, and Mrs. Garcia told me she's been forgetting appointments. I think we need to start documenting these incidents more formally." This was a complete lie. I had never left the stove on, and I had not missed any appointments. Mrs. Garcia later confirmed to me that Victoria had asked her to report any signs of confusion or forgetfulness, offering to pay her extra for keeping track of my daily activities. Even more troubling was Victoria's campaign to influence other family members. I discovered that she had been having regular coffee meetings with Sarah, my daughter-in-law, during which she expressed concerns about my mental state and my potential impact on the children's inheritance. "I'm just worried about Emma and Sophie's college funds," Victoria had said during one conversation I overheard when Sarah brought the girls for a visit. "If Eleanor starts giving away the company money to strangers, there might not be anything left for the grandchildren's education." Sarah, to her credit, had seemed uncomfortable with these conversations, but I could see that Victoria's concerns were having an impact. Sarah began watching me more closely during visits, and she started gently questioning me about business decisions in ways that suggested she had been coached on what to ask. The situation reached a boiling point during our June board meeting when Victoria showed up unannounced, claiming that Robert had asked her to observe the proceedings because he was concerned about some recent decisions I had made. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," our CFO Janet Morrison said diplomatically, "but board meetings are restricted to board members and specifically invited guests." "Oh, I understand completely," Victoria replied with her sweetest smile. "Robert just wanted me to be here in case Eleanor needed any assistance with the technical discussions." She's been having some trouble lately keeping track of complex information. The room fell completely silent. Victoria had just publicly suggested that I was incompetent to run my own company in front of my entire executive team. "Victoria," I said, my voice calm but carrying the authority I had developed over decades of leadership. "You are not welcome in this boardroom, and your husband has no authority to invite you to observe proceedings that involve confidential company information. Please leave immediately." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes before the sweet smile returned. "Of course, Eleanor. I was just trying to help. I'll wait outside." After she left, the tension in the room was palpable. Tom Bradley, our head of manufacturing and the person who had worked with me longest, spoke first. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that everyone in this room has complete confidence in your leadership. If anyone is suggesting otherwise, they're wrong." The other board members murmured agreement, but I could see that Victoria's performance had planted seeds of doubt. Her suggestion that I needed assistance with technical discussions was particularly insidious because it played on stereotypes about aging and disability while appearing to come from a place of concern. After the meeting, I called an emergency session with David Chen and Maria Santos. It was time to take decisive action before Victoria's campaign escalated further. "Mrs. Whitmore, based on what you've told me, I believe your daughter-in-law is building a case to challenge your mental competency," David said bluntly. "The pattern of behavior you're describing, the documentation of supposed incidents, the attempts to influence other family members, it's all consistent with someone preparing for a legal challenge." Maria nodded in agreement. "The good news is that you've been documenting everything, and the security footage should provide strong evidence of her actual motivations. But we need to be prepared for this to escalate quickly." "What kind of escalation are we talking about?" I asked. "Competency hearings, guardianship proceedings, attempts to remove you from company leadership," David replied. "If she can convince a court that you're not mentally competent to manage your affairs, she could potentially gain control over your assets through Robert." The magnitude of what I was facing began to sink in. This was not just about family dynamics or hurt feelings. This was about the potential loss of everything I had built and everything I had planned for my legacy. "What do we need to do to protect myself and my wishes?" I asked. David and Maria exchanged glances before David spoke. "We need to establish clear, uncontestable documentation of your mental competency. I'm going to recommend that you undergo a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who specializes in capacity assessments for estate planning. We also need to finalize your will and foundation documents immediately. And," Maria added, "we need to be prepared for Victoria to make some kind of dramatic move soon. People like her don't usually wait once they realize their target is becoming aware of their actions." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed since that first dinner when Victoria complained about my hearing aid. What had seemed like a small family annoyance had revealed itself as part of a calculated campaign to strip me of my autonomy and my legacy. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her scheming. She had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. I was not just a wealthy widow with a hearing aid. I was Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had built a business empire from nothing, who had weathered economic storms and personal tragedies, and who had no intention of allowing anyone to take away what I had worked my entire life to create. The neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Harper took place over 2 days and included extensive cognitive testing, memory assessments, and evaluation of my decision-making capacity. The results were unambiguous. My cognitive function was not only normal for my age, but actually above average in several key areas. "Mrs. Whitmore, you scored in the top 15% of adults your age on every measure we administered," Dr. Harper told me during our results meeting. "There is absolutely no evidence of any cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. Your mind is as sharp as someone 20 years younger." Armed with this documentation, David Chen finalized my will and the foundation paperwork. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation would receive 30% of my estate, with the remaining 70% divided between my sons, grandchildren, and several smaller charitable bequests. It was a generous legacy for my family while also ensuring that my wealth would benefit others who needed opportunities. Now it was time to let Victoria know that I was aware of her campaign and that she had failed to achieve her objectives. But I decided to wait for her to make the next move, confident that she would soon overplay her hand. I did not have to wait long. The confrontation came during what was supposed to be a family celebration dinner for my grandson's 10th birthday. Victoria had been unusually quiet during the meal, but I could sense tension building as she kept glancing at Robert and making subtle gestures toward him. Finally, as we were clearing the dishes, Victoria stood up and addressed the room with the dramatic flair that had become her trademark. "Family, I think we need to have a difficult conversation," she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I've been watching Eleanor very carefully over the past few months, and I'm deeply concerned about her well-being and her ability to make sound decisions." The room went completely silent. Even the children stopped chattering and looked around with confused expressions. Victoria continued, pulling out a folder she had apparently prepared in advance. "I've documented multiple incidents where Eleanor has shown signs of confusion, memory problems, and poor judgment. She's been making financial decisions without consulting family, she can't manage her hearing aid properly in professional settings, and she's been giving away family assets to people she barely knows." Robert looked deeply uncomfortable but remained silent. Michael stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to object, but Victoria pressed on. "I think it's time we seriously considered whether Eleanor needs professional care, and whether she should still be making major decisions about the company and her estate without family oversight." The audacity was breathtaking. Victoria was essentially staging an intervention in my own dining room, using my birthday celebration as the venue to declare me incompetent. I looked around the room at my family members, watching their faces to see who would stand with me and who would allow this ambush to continue. Sarah looked horrified and was shaking her head slightly. Michael appeared angry and was starting to speak up. But Robert, my eldest son, was looking at his wife with what appeared to be admiration rather than shock. That was when I realized that this was not Victoria acting alone. This was a coordinated effort, and my own son was part of it. The betrayal cut deeper than I had expected, but it also clarified my resolve. If my family was determined to treat me like an incompetent elderly woman who could be manipulated and controlled, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I stood up slowly, maintaining the dignity and composure that had served me well in countless business negotiations and difficult personal situations. "Victoria," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I want to thank you for this enlightening performance. It has revealed a great deal about your character and your motivations. It has also made some important decisions much easier for me." I walked to my study and retrieved the folder containing Dr. Harper's evaluation, my finalized will, and several other documents I had prepared for exactly this moment. "Since you're so concerned about my mental competency," I continued, returning to the dining room where everyone remained frozen in place, "I thought you might be interested in these recent psychological evaluations that conclusively demonstrate that my cognitive function is not only normal but superior." I handed the evaluation results to Robert, watching his face as he scanned the official findings that completely contradicted his wife's narrative. "I've also completed updating my will and estate plans," I announced. "All of my affairs are in perfect order, managed by someone who has been declared fully competent by medical professionals." Victoria's face had gone white, but she was not ready to give up. "Eleanor, honey, I know you're upset, but the family has a right to be concerned about these big financial decisions you've been making without talking to anyone." "What financial decisions specifically?" I asked. "Well, the foundation thing you've been planning with lawyers. That's a huge amount of money you're planning to give away to strangers." There it was. The real issue was finally out in the open. This had never been about my hearing aid or my mental competency. This was about money, and Victoria's belief that she was entitled to control my legacy. "Victoria, the last time I checked, this was still my money, earned through my work, and I have every right to distribute it according to my wishes. But what interests me more is how you know about my estate planning when I haven't discussed it with anyone in this room." Victoria's eyes darted around nervously, realizing she had revealed information she should not have had access to. I continued. What also interests me is this folder of documented incidents you mentioned. I'd love to see these incidents, because I have my own documentation that might paint a very different picture of recent events. I reached into my study folder again and pulled out printed screenshots from my security cameras, showing Victoria going through my personal papers, photographing documents, and searching through my private spaces. These images were captured by security cameras I had installed after I began to suspect that someone was violating my privacy and potentially stealing confidential information. The room erupted. Sarah gasped audibly. Michael stepped forward to look at the photographs more closely. Even Robert appeared shocked by the evidence of his wife's invasive behavior. But Victoria was not finished. In what I later realized was her final desperate gambit, she turned to the assembled family and made one last attempt to save her scheme. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Eleanor is so paranoid that she's installed spy cameras in her own home. She's suspicious of her own family. This kind of behavior is exactly why she needs help managing her affairs." It was a clever move, attempting to reframe evidence of her wrongdoing as proof of my incompetency. But she had finally pushed too far, and her mask had completely slipped. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law was gone, replaced by someone desperate and angry and willing to say anything to regain control of the situation. Michael spoke first, his voice carrying a tone of disgust I had rarely heard from my usually diplomatic younger son. "Victoria, you were caught on camera going through Mom's private papers without permission. That's not paranoia, that's theft. And frankly, after seeing this evidence, I think Mom was smart to protect herself." Sarah nodded in agreement, moving closer to stand beside me in a gesture of support that meant more than she probably realized. But the most important moment came when Robert finally spoke. My eldest son, who had remained silent throughout most of this confrontation, looked directly at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. "Victoria, is this true? Did you go through Mom's papers without permission?" Victoria's response revealed everything about her character and her motivations. Instead of apologizing or trying to explain her actions, she attacked. "Robert, whose side are you on here? I'm trying to protect your inheritance, trying to make sure your mother doesn't give away everything you've worked for to some charity full of strangers. And you're going to stand there and lecture me about looking through some papers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria had just admitted that her entire campaign against me was motivated by greed and her desire to control my estate for her own benefit. Robert looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, and what he saw clearly disturbed him. "Victoria, that money doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Mom, and she has every right to do whatever she wants with it." Victoria's final mask fell away completely. "Don't be naive, Robert. She's 73 years old with a hearing aid. How long do you think she's going to be able to manage a $47 million company? How long before she makes a mistake that costs all of us everything?" And there it was. The truth I had suspected but hoped was not accurate. Victoria saw my age and my disability as evidence that I was unfit to control my own life and assets. She had been planning not just to influence my decisions, but to take control of them entirely. I looked around the room at my family, some of whom had supported Victoria's campaign, and others who were just learning the extent of her manipulation. The hurt was deep and would take time to heal. But I also felt something else, relief that the truth was finally in the open, and determination to make sure that Victoria's scheme failed completely. "Victoria," I said, my voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of experience and 30 years of business leadership, "you have seriously misjudged the situation. My age and my hearing aid do not make me weak or incompetent. They make me experienced and careful. And right now, both of those qualities are telling me that you are dangerous to this family and to everything I have built." I turned to Robert, my son who had been manipulated but who now seemed to be seeing his wife clearly for the first time. "Robert, you have a choice to make. You can continue to support your wife's campaign to paint me as incompetent so she can control my assets. Or you can remember who raised you and who has always had your best interests at heart." The room waited in silence, as Robert wrestled with the implications of what had been revealed. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Victoria, I think you need to apologize to my mother and to this family. What you've done is wrong." But Victoria was beyond apologies or reconciliation. She had invested too much in her campaign and revealed too much of her true character to back down now. "I won't apologize for trying to protect this family from an old woman who's losing her mind," she snapped. "Mark my words, she's going to destroy everything Charles built, and you'll all be sorry you didn't listen to me." With that, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of my house, leaving behind a family that would never be the same but that might, eventually, be stronger for having confronted the truth about who she really was. As I watched her car disappear down my driveway, I reflected on how a complaint about my hearing aid had ultimately revealed the true character of someone I had welcomed into my family. Victoria had seen my age and disability as weaknesses to be exploited, but she had underestimated the strength that comes from experience and the power that comes from being underestimated. The next morning, I called David Chen and informed him that there might be legal consequences to consider regarding Victoria's theft of confidential documents and her attempts to manipulate my family members. I also asked him to expedite the final execution of my will and the establishment of the foundation. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to say that you've handled this situation with remarkable grace and intelligence," David told me. "Not everyone would have had the foresight to document everything and protect themselves the way you did." David, when you've spent as many years as I have, dealing with people who underestimate others based on age, gender, or disability, you learn to be prepared for almost anything. But the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead as my family worked to repair the damage that Victoria's manipulation had caused. The trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild, and some relationships might never fully recover. However, I was confident about one thing. Victoria had failed in her ultimate objective. My will was legally sound, my mental competency was documented by medical professionals, and my legacy would be distributed according to my wishes, not hers. Most importantly, my family now understood that my hearing aid was simply a tool that helped me navigate the world, not a sign of weakness or incompetence. They had learned that age and disability do not automatically equal vulnerability, and that someone who has built a successful life and business is probably quite capable of managing their own affairs. As I sat in my study that evening, adjusting my hearing aid to the perfect volume for listening to classical music, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me. Victoria had complained that my hearing aid was too loud, never realizing that it was allowing me to hear every word of her manipulative campaign. She had treated me as if I were invisible or irrelevant, but I had been listening, learning, and planning all along. And when it came time for the most important conversation of all, the reading of my final will and testament, she would discover that I had heard everything perfectly clearly, and that her efforts to control my legacy had failed completely. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation would provide educational opportunities for deserving students for generations to come. My family would inherit generously, but they would also understand that wealth comes with responsibility. And Victoria would learn that underestimating someone because of their age or disability is a costly mistake that can destroy everything you think you're trying to protect. My hearing aid had been loud enough to capture every detail of her deception, and soon, everyone would hear the truth just as clearly as I had. The week following Victoria's dramatic exit brought an unexpected calm to my life, like the stillness after a violent storm has passed through. But I knew better than to mistake this quiet for peace. In my experience, people like Victoria don't simply disappear when their first plan fails. They regroup, they adapt, and they return with more sophisticated weapons. My instincts proved correct 3 days later when Mrs. Garcia approached me in my kitchen, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to tell you something important," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "Mrs. Victoria, she came to my house yesterday evening. She offered me $5,000 to sign a paper saying that you have been confused and forgetful, that you leave things on the stove and forget where you put important items." The audacity took my breath away. Victoria was now attempting to bribe my housekeeper to provide false testimony about my mental state. This was no longer family manipulation. This was fraud. What did you tell her, Mrs. Garcia? I told her no, of course. You are one of the sharpest people I know, Mrs. Whitmore. In 3 years working for you, I have never seen you confused about anything. But she said she would pay me more money if I changed my mind, and she said I should think about my family's future. The implied threat was clear. Victoria was suggesting that Mrs. Garcia's employment might be in jeopardy if she didn't cooperate with the scheme to declare me incompetent. I immediately called Maria Santos and asked her to meet with Mrs. Garcia to document this attempted bribery. I also contacted David Chen to discuss the legal implications of Victoria's escalating behavior. Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing constitutes witness tampering, attempted fraud, and potentially extortion, David said grimly. Victoria has crossed the line from family manipulation into criminal behavior, but Victoria's campaign was far from over. That same afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Newman, my audiologist, asking if I could come in for an urgent appointment. Mrs. Whitmore, I've received some concerning information about your condition that I need to discuss with you immediately, she said, her professional tone unable to mask her obvious worry. When I arrived at her office, Dr. Newman showed me a detailed letter she had received from someone identifying themselves as my daughter-in-law, expressing grave concerns about my deteriorating hearing and cognitive function. According to this letter, you've been having severe problems with your hearing aid, becoming confused during conversations, and showing signs of significant cognitive decline, Dr. Newman explained. The writer suggests that your hearing loss may be affecting your mental function and recommends immediate evaluation for possible dementia. I read through Victoria's letter, marveling at her attention to detail and her ability to weave just enough truth into her lies to make them sound credible. She described real events, like family dinners and business meetings, but twisted every detail to support her narrative of my declining competence. Dr. Newman, have you observed any of these problems during our appointments? I asked. Absolutely not. Your hearing aid function has been excellent, and you've shown no signs of confusion or cognitive issues. That's why I was so surprised to receive this letter. It describes a completely different person than the patient I've been treating. I explained the situation with Victoria's manipulation campaign, showing Dr. Newman the documentation Maria Santos had helped me compile. Her professional expression shifted to one of anger and disgust. Mrs. Whitmore, this is medical fraud. Someone is attempting to manipulate your medical records and potentially compromise your care based on completely false information. I'm going to document this incident thoroughly and report it to the appropriate authorities. Dr. Newman's support was reassuring, but it also highlighted how far Victoria was willing to go. She was now attempting to corrupt my medical records and potentially influence my healthcare providers to support her narrative of incompetence. That evening, Robert called and asked if he could come over to talk. His voice sounded strained and exhausted, and I suspected that the aftermath of Victoria's exposed manipulation was taking a toll on their marriage. When he arrived, Robert looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the past week. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. Mom, I need to apologize to you for everything that's happened, he began, settling heavily into the chair across from my kitchen table. I've been blind to what Victoria was doing, and I let her convince me that her concerns were legitimate. I studied my eldest son, searching his face for signs of sincerity or continued manipulation. What I saw was genuine remorse, but also something else that concerned me. Robert, what exactly has Victoria told you about her recent activities? Do you know about her attempt to bribe Mrs. Garcia, or her contact with my doctor? His face went white. What are you talking about? Victoria said she was backing off, that she realized she had overreacted. I showed Robert the documentation from Mrs. Garcia and the letter Victoria had sent to Dr. Newman. As he read through the evidence, I watched his expression shift from confusion to horror to something approaching despair. She lied to me, he said quietly. She told me she was sorry for how things went at dinner, that she understood she had gone too far. All week she's been talking about making amends and rebuilding relationships, but she was actually escalating her attack behind my back. Robert, I need you to understand something. Victoria's behavior goes far beyond family disagreements or even manipulation. She's now engaging in criminal activities. Attempting to bribe witnesses and submitting false information to medical professionals are serious crimes. Robert put his head in his hands, and I could see his shoulders shaking. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Mom, I don't know what to do. She's my wife. We have a life together, financial obligations, shared friends. But what she's doing to you is unforgivable." I felt a surge of sympathy for my son, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of her criminal behavior. But I also needed him to understand the gravity of the situation. "Robert, Victoria has made it clear that she sees me as an obstacle to be removed by any means necessary. She's not going to stop until she either succeeds in having me declared incompetent or until she's forced to stop by legal consequences." We talked for nearly 2 hours, with Robert gradually coming to terms with the extent of Victoria's deception. He revealed details about their marriage that painted a picture of a woman who was controlling, manipulative, and obsessed with social status and financial security. "She's always been focused on money and appearances," Robert admitted. "But I thought that was normal. I thought she was just practical and ambitious. I never realized that she saw people, including me, as tools to achieve her goals." Before Robert left that night, he made a decision that would have profound consequences for everyone involved. "Mom, I'm going to ask Victoria for a separation. I can't continue to be married to someone who would try to destroy my own mother for financial gain. And I want you to know that if you need me to testify against her in any legal proceedings, I will." The next morning brought news that Victoria had not taken Robert's separation request well. According to my son, she had flown into a rage, accusing him of choosing his mother over his wife and threatening to take him for everything he was worth in a divorce. But more concerning was what Robert reported about Victoria's threats regarding me. She said that if I moved out, she would make sure everyone in town knew that my mother was a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs, Robert told me during a phone call. She also said she had documentation that would prove you're incompetent, and that she wouldn't hesitate to use it. I realized that Victoria's separation from Robert would likely escalate her campaign against me. With nothing left to lose in terms of family relationships, she might become even more dangerous and unpredictable. My concerns proved justified when Maria Santos called me that afternoon with disturbing news from her investigation. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've discovered that Victoria has been much more active than we initially realized. She's been contacting people throughout your social and professional circles, spreading rumors about your mental condition and suggesting that you're no longer capable of managing your business or personal affairs." Maria had documented contacts Victoria had made with members of my country club, several board members from charitable organizations where I served, and even some of Whitmore Industries' major clients. In each case, Victoria had presented herself as a concerned family member, worried about my declining mental state. "The pattern is very sophisticated," Maria explained. "She's not making direct accusations that could be easily disproven. Instead, she's asking people if they've noticed any changes in you, expressing concern about your welfare, and suggesting that the family is worried about your safety." This approach was particularly insidious because it planted seeds of doubt while appearing to come from a place of love and concern. People who had known me for years were now primed to look for signs of cognitive decline, and normal behaviors associated with aging or hearing loss might be interpreted as evidence supporting Victoria's narrative. The most alarming discovery came when Maria revealed that Victoria had approached several attorneys who specialized in elder law and guardianship cases. "She's been shopping for lawyers who might be willing to file a competency challenge on behalf of your family," Maria reported. "Most have refused after hearing her story and reviewing the lack of medical evidence, but she appears to be persistent in finding someone who will take the case." The implications were chilling. Victoria was actively seeking legal representation to have me declared mentally incompetent, despite having no medical evidence and despite the thorough evaluation that had confirmed my cognitive health. That evening, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of this entire situation. I called an emergency meeting with David Chen, Maria Santos, and Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the neuropsychologist who had evaluated my mental competency. "I want to take the offensive," I announced as we gathered in David's conference room. "Victoria is counting on me being passive and defensive while she builds her case." Instead, I want to expose her campaign publicly and hold her accountable for her criminal behavior. David leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Whitmore, that's a significant escalation. Once we file criminal complaints and publicize her behavior, there's no going back. Are you prepared for the consequences? David, Victoria has made it clear that she intends to destroy my reputation and take control of my assets by any means necessary. I'm not going to wait for her to find an unscrupulous attorney or to convince enough people that I'm incompetent. It's time to fight back. Dr. Harper spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, from a clinical perspective, I want to emphasize that your cognitive function is excellent, and you're absolutely capable of making these decisions. But I also want to make sure you've considered the emotional toll this kind of public battle might take. I appreciated her concern, but my resolve was firm. Doctor, I've spent my entire career building something meaningful. I'm not going to let someone destroy that legacy because they're greedy and manipulative. Victoria has escalated the situation far beyond family dynamics. Now she needs to face the consequences of her actions. Over the next week, we put together a comprehensive case documenting Victoria's criminal behavior and her systematic campaign to discredit me. The evidence was overwhelming. Attempted witness tampering with Mrs. Garcia, medical fraud in her communications with Dr. Newman, defamation in her communications with my professional and social contacts, and conspiracy to commit fraud in her attempts to find attorneys who would file false competency claims. But the most damaging evidence came from the continued surveillance footage from my home security system. Victoria had returned to my house twice while Robert was at work, apparently believing she still had access since she had kept her key. The cameras captured her going through my personal papers, photographing documents, and even attempting to access my computer. On her second unauthorized visit, the cameras recorded Victoria placing several items in unusual locations around my house, including my reading glasses in the refrigerator and my car keys in a kitchen drawer. When I discovered these items in strange places, I realized she was creating evidence of confusion and memory loss by staging incidents she could later report to others. The sophistication of her manipulation was breathtaking. Victoria was literally creating false evidence of my cognitive decline by moving my personal items and then planning to use these incidents as proof that I was becoming forgetful and confused. Armed with this documentation, Maria Santos and I visited the local police department to file formal criminal complaints against Victoria. Detective Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in elder abuse cases, reviewed our evidence with growing concern. Mrs. Whitmore, what you've documented here represents one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases I've ever seen, Detective Mitchell said. This goes far beyond typical family disputes. Mrs. Victoria Hayes has engaged in multiple felonies in her attempt to control your assets and reputation. The detective explained that Victoria could face charges of criminal trespass, attempted fraud, witness tampering, defamation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each charge carried significant penalties, including potential imprisonment. However, Detective Mitchell cautioned, you should be prepared for Victoria to escalate her behavior once she realizes she's facing criminal prosecution. People who engage in this kind of systematic manipulation often become desperate when their schemes are exposed. Her warning proved prophetic. 2 days after the criminal complaints were filed, Victoria made her most audacious move yet. I was at Whitmore Industries for our monthly board meeting when Janet Morrison, our CFO, approached me with a concerned expression. Mrs. Whitmore, I've received a very disturbing communication that I need to discuss with you immediately, Janet said, handing me an official-looking document. The document was a formal notice from an attorney named Harrison Webb, claiming to represent my family and seeking emergency guardianship over my person and estate due to my alleged mental incompetence. The notice demanded that I immediately cease all business activities and submit to a court-ordered mental health evaluation. I read through the document with growing amazement at its audacity. Attorney Webb claimed to have extensive documentation of my mental decline, including statements from family members, medical professionals, and household staff. Every single claim was either completely false or a gross distortion of reality. But the most shocking aspect was the notice's demand that I immediately transfer control of Whitmore Industries to a temporary management committee headed by Robert Hayes, pending the outcome of competency proceedings. Victoria had found her unscrupulous attorney, and she was making her final, desperate play for control of my company and my assets. I immediately contacted David Chen, who reviewed the document with professional disgust. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is one of the most frivolous and legally inappropriate filings I've ever seen," David said. "Attorney Webb has made numerous false statements and has filed for emergency guardianship without meeting any of the legal requirements for such proceedings." David explained that legitimate guardianship cases required substantial medical evidence and following specific legal procedures. Victoria and her attorney had apparently decided to bypass these requirements and hoped that a sympathetic judge might grant their request based on emotional appeals and false documentation. "The good news is that this filing is so obviously fraudulent that it actually strengthens our case against Victoria," David continued. "She's now engaged in filing false legal documents, which is a serious felony. But we still needed to respond quickly and decisively to prevent any temporary disruption to my business operations or personal autonomy." David filed an immediate response challenging the guardianship petition and demanding sanctions against Attorney Webb for filing frivolous and false legal documents. "We also provided the court with Dr. Harper's comprehensive mental competency evaluation and all of our documentation of Victoria's criminal campaign. More importantly, we requested an emergency hearing to address the fraudulent nature of the guardianship petition and to seek protective orders against Victoria's continued harassment." The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, giving us less than a week to prepare for what would essentially be a trial about my mental competency and Victoria's criminal behavior. During those preparation days, I discovered just how extensive Victoria's final campaign had become. She had contacted dozens of people in my professional and personal circles, claiming that my family was desperately trying to protect me from my own poor judgment, but that I was resisting their help due to paranoia and confusion. Several people who had known me for years called to express concern about my welfare, having been convinced by Victoria's performance that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. The most painful call came from Margaret Collins, my former colleague from the Chamber of Commerce, who gently suggested that I might want to consider stepping back from my responsibilities before something terrible happened. "Eleanor, dear, we all get older, and there's no shame in accepting help when we need it," Margaret said, with genuine concern in her voice. "Your daughter-in-law seems like such a caring person, and she's so worried about you living alone in that big house." I realized that Victoria had been masterfully manipulating my social network, presenting herself as a devoted family member, making heartbreaking sacrifices to care for a beloved but declining relative. People who should have known better were accepting her narrative because it fit their preconceptions about aging, and because Victoria was a skilled performer. The night before the hearing, Robert came to my house for what he described as possibly our last conversation, before everything changed forever. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm testifying on your behalf tomorrow," he said. "I'm going to tell the court exactly what Victoria has been doing and how she manipulated me into supporting her initial concerns." I felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Having Robert's testimony would be crucial in demonstrating that Victoria's campaign was based on deception rather than legitimate family concerns. "Robert, this is going to be very difficult for you. Victoria will likely portray you as being manipulated by me or claim that you're betraying your own wife for financial reasons. I know, Mom, but I can't let her destroy you for her own greed. I've already lost my marriage by choosing to do the right thing. I'm not going to lose my integrity too." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how far this situation had escalated since Victoria first complained about my hearing aid being too loud. What had started as apparent annoyance about an assistive device had revealed itself as part of a comprehensive plan to strip me of my autonomy, my business, and my legacy. But Victoria had made a fundamental miscalculation in her scheming. She had assumed that because I was older and wore a hearing aid, I would be passive and vulnerable to her manipulation. She had forgotten that my hearing aid allowed me to hear everything clearly, including every word of her deceptive campaign. Tomorrow, in a courtroom where I had once presided as a judge, I would have to defend my right to control my own life and assets. But I was ready for the battle, armed with truth, documentation, and the support of people who actually cared about my welfare, rather than my wealth. Victoria would discover that my hearing had been perfectly clear throughout her entire campaign, and that her efforts to paint me as incompetent had only demonstrated her own moral bankruptcy. The morning of the hearing brought an autumn chill that matched my mood as I prepared to fight for my fundamental rights as a human being. I chose my clothes carefully, selecting a navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and authority. This was not just a legal proceeding. This was a performance where every detail of my appearance and demeanor would be scrutinized for signs of the incompetence Victoria claimed to have documented. As David Chen and I arrived at the courthouse, I noticed that the media had somehow learned about the case. Several reporters and photographers were positioned outside the building, apparently drawn by the unusual spectacle of a wealthy businesswoman fighting her own family's attempt to have her declared incompetent. "Mrs. Whitmore, how do you respond to allegations that you're no longer capable of managing your business empire?" one reporter shouted as we walked toward the entrance. I paused and turned to address the cameras, recognizing this as an opportunity to control the narrative before Victoria could spin her version of events. I respond by noting that these allegations come from someone who has been caught engaging in criminal behavior, including breaking into my home, attempting to bribe witnesses, and filing false legal documents. I said calmly, "The evidence will show that this case is about greed, not concern for my welfare." Inside the courthouse, I was struck by the familiarity of the environment and the irony of my situation. This was the same building where I had spent decades making decisions about other people's lives and rights. Now I was here, fighting for my own autonomy in a courtroom where justice was supposed to prevail over manipulation and fraud. Judge Patricia Hendricks was presiding over the case, a relatively young jurist whom I knew by reputation but had never worked with directly. This was actually advantageous, as it eliminated any potential conflicts of interest or claims of bias based on our professional relationship. As I took my seat at the respondents' table with David Chen, I observed Victoria sitting with her attorney Harrison Webb at the petitioner's table. Victoria had clearly dressed for maximum effect, wearing a conservative black dress and minimal makeup to project an image of respectful solemnity. She looked like a grieving daughter-in-law reluctantly taking difficult action to protect a beloved family member. Attorney Webb was a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that suggested success in his chosen field of elder law. As I watched him organize his materials, I wondered what Victoria had told him to convince him to take such an obviously fraudulent case. Judge Hendricks called the proceedings to order and asked Attorney Webb to present his case for emergency guardianship. "Your Honor, this is a heartbreaking situation involving a once brilliant woman whose cognitive decline has reached the point where she poses a danger to herself and others," Webb began, his voice carrying precisely the right tone of respectful concern. He went on to paint a picture of me as a confused, paranoid elderly woman who had become suspicious of my own family and was making increasingly poor decisions about my business and personal affairs. According to Webb's presentation, my hearing problems had somehow accelerated cognitive decline, and my family was desperately trying to protect me from the consequences of my deteriorating mental state. The petitioner's evidence will show that Mrs. Whitmore has exhibited classic signs of dementia, including memory loss, confusion about time and place, paranoid suspicions about family members, and dangerous behaviors such as leaving appliances running unattended. Quote, Webb continued, "As he spoke, I marveled at Victoria's ability to transform normal life events into evidence of mental incompetence. Every incident he described was either completely fabricated or a gross distortion of reality, but he presented each one with the confidence of someone stating established facts." Webb's first witness was Dr. Patricia Chen, a physician I had never met who claimed to have reviewed my case and found clear evidence of cognitive impairment. Based on the behavioral reports provided by Mrs. Whitmore's family, she exhibits a pattern consistent with early to moderate dementia, Dr. Chen testified. The combination of hearing loss and reported confusion suggests that her condition may be progressing rapidly. David Chen immediately objected to this testimony, pointing out that Dr. Patricia Chen had never examined me or reviewed any of my actual medical records. Judge Hendricks sustained the objection and instructed the jury to disregard the witness's conclusions about my mental state. But the damage was already being done. Webb was systematically presenting a narrative of decline and incompetence, building toward his ultimate argument that I needed court protection from my own poor judgment. Victoria took the witness stand next, and her performance was masterful. She spoke softly, often dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, as she described her growing concerns about my welfare. "I love Eleanor like my own mother," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "Watching her decline has been one of the most painful experiences of my life. But I can't stand by and watch her hurt herself, or make decisions that will destroy everything she and Charles built together." She went on to describe a series of incidents that supposedly demonstrated my cognitive decline: finding my car keys in the refrigerator, discovering that I had left the stove running overnight, witnessing me become confused during business meetings, and observing my increasing suspicion of family members who were only trying to help. Every single incident was either completely false or a distortion of events she had orchestrated herself. The car keys in the refrigerator, for instance, referred to the security camera footage showing Victoria deliberately placing them there during one of her unauthorized visits to my home. But Victoria's presentation was so convincing, so filled with specific details and emotional authenticity, that I could see it having an impact on Judge Hendricks. This was a woman who appeared to be making enormous personal sacrifices to protect someone she loved, even at the cost of family relationships and personal reputation. When David Chen began his cross-examination of Victoria, the courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. "Mrs. Hayes, you testified that you found Mrs. Whitmore's car keys in her refrigerator. When exactly did this occur?" "About 3 weeks ago, when I stopped by to check on her," Victoria replied confidently. "And Mrs. Whitmore was present when you made this discovery?" "No, she was resting upstairs. I didn't want to embarrass her by mentioning it." David walked to the evidence table and retrieved a tablet computer. "Your Honor, I'd like to present security footage from Mrs. Whitmore's home, showing the actual incident Mrs. Hayes is describing." Webb immediately objected, claiming that the footage was inadmissible and potentially doctored. But Judge Hendricks allowed the evidence to be presented, and the courtroom watched in stunned silence as the video clearly showed Victoria entering my home with her own key, taking my car keys from the kitchen counter and deliberately placing them inside the refrigerator. The footage was damning, but Victoria's response was even more revealing. "That video is fake," she declared loudly. "Eleanor has become so paranoid that she's having fake evidence created to frame me. This is exactly the kind of delusional behavior I've been trying to protect the family from." Even Attorney Webb looked shocked by his client's response. Accusing someone of fabricating security footage was a serious allegation that could easily be disproven by technical analysis. David continued his cross-examination, systematically demolishing every incident Victoria had cited as evidence of my incompetence. The overnight stove incident was revealed as a complete fabrication. The business meeting confusion was shown to be Victoria's misinterpretation of normal professional discussions. The suspicion of family members was demonstrated to be a reasonable response to Victoria's documented criminal behavior. But the most devastating moment came when David asked Victoria about her communications with my medical providers. "Mrs. Hayes, did you contact Dr. Patricia Newman, Mrs. Whitmore's audiologist, to express concerns about her condition?" Victoria hesitated, clearly uncertain how much David knew about her activities. "I may have mentioned to some of Eleanor's doctors that the family was concerned," she said carefully. David presented Dr. Newman's letter detailing Victoria's false medical claims and her attempts to influence my treatment based on fabricated symptoms. "Mrs. Hayes, did you tell Dr. Newman that Mrs. Whitmore was showing signs of dementia and recommended that she be evaluated for cognitive decline?" "I was just trying to make sure Eleanor got the help she needed," Victoria replied, but her confident demeanor was finally beginning to crack. "And did you offer to pay Mrs. Garcia $5,000 to sign a statement saying that Mrs. Whitmore was confused and forgetful?" Webb objected strenuously to this line of questioning, but Judge Hendricks overruled him and directed Victoria to answer. "I never tried to bribe anyone," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. David then called Mrs. Garcia to testify about Victoria's attempted bribery. My housekeeper's testimony was simple, direct, and completely credible. She described Victoria's visit to her home, the specific offer of money in exchange for false testimony, and the implied threats about her continued, screamed. "I'm the victim here. That old woman has manipulated everyone against me. She's not competent to make these decisions. Someone needs to protect the family from her mistakes." Even while being arrested, Victoria continued to insist that I was the real problem, and that her criminal behavior was somehow justified by her perception of my incompetence. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, Attorney Webb requested permission to withdraw from the case, claiming that he had been misled by his client about the facts of the situation. Judge Hendricks granted Webb's withdrawal motion, but also indicated that his conduct in filing such an obviously frivolous petition would be subject to disciplinary review by the State Bar Association. With Victoria under arrest and her attorney withdrawing, the guardianship petition collapsed entirely. Judge Hendricks dismissed the case and issued a scathing written order documenting the fraudulent nature of the proceedings and the criminal behavior that had motivated them. But more importantly, Judge Hendricks issued a permanent protective order, preventing Victoria from contacting me, entering my property, or interfering with my business or personal affairs in any way. As I walked out of the courthouse with David Chen, I felt a sense of vindication and relief that was almost overwhelming. Victoria's comprehensive campaign to have me declared incompetent had not only failed, but had resulted in her facing serious criminal charges that could lead to years in prison. The reporters who had gathered outside the courthouse were eager for comment, and I decided to make a brief statement that would ensure the truth of this situation was properly understood. Today's proceedings have demonstrated that age and disability do not make someone vulnerable to exploitation, I said, facing the cameras directly. They have also shown that people who attempt to manipulate the legal system for personal gain will be held accountable for their criminal behavior. I paused, adjusting my hearing aid to make sure I could hear any questions clearly, before continuing. My hearing aid has never been too loud. It has simply allowed me to hear the truth clearly, including every word of the deception and manipulation that was directed against me. Justice has been served today, and I look forward to continuing to manage my own affairs with the same competence I've demonstrated throughout my entire career. As David and I drove away from the courthouse, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me about family, trust, and the intersection of ageism and ableism in our society. Victoria had counted on people's assumptions about aging and disability to support her fraudulent case, but she had underestimated both my resilience and the power of truth when it's properly documented and presented. My hearing aid had indeed been the key to this entire situation, but not in the way Victoria had intended. Instead of being a sign of weakness or incompetence, it had been the tool that allowed me to hear every detail of her manipulation, to gather the evidence needed to expose her crimes, and to protect myself from someone who saw my age and disability as opportunities for exploitation. Victoria would face trial for her crimes, and I would continue to manage my business and distribute my wealth according to my own values and priorities. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation would provide educational opportunities for generations of students who needed them, and my family would inherit a legacy based on integrity rather than greed. But perhaps most importantly, my experience would serve as a warning to others who might assume that age or disability makes someone an easy target for manipulation. Victoria had learned too late that underestimating people based on physical limitations or stereotypes about aging is a dangerous mistake that can destroy everything you think you're trying to protect. The days following Victoria's arrest brought an unexpected flood of support from people I had thought might have been turned against me by her manipulation campaign. Margaret Collins from the Chamber of Commerce was among the first to call, her voice filled with embarrassment and regret. "Eleanor, I owe you a tremendous apology," Margaret said. "I had no idea that woman was feeding me lies about your condition. When I saw the news coverage of her arrest, I realized how completely she had deceived me, and probably dozens of other people." Similar calls came from board members of charitable organizations where I served, clients of Whitmore Industries, and even casual acquaintances from my country club. Victoria's systematic campaign to undermine my reputation had been more extensive than I had realized, but her arrest and the exposure of her criminal behavior had reversed much of the damage she had attempted to cause. Dr. Patricia Newman called to inform me that she had filed a formal complaint with the State Medical Board about Victoria's attempts to manipulate my medical records and treatment. "Mrs. Whitmore, what that woman did constitutes a serious violation of medical ethics and patient privacy," Dr. Newman explained. "Her actions could have compromised your health care and potentially endangered your well-being. The medical board takes these violations very seriously." I appreciated Dr. Newman's support, but I was more concerned about the long-term implications of Victoria's behavior for other elderly people who might not have the resources or knowledge to protect themselves from similar manipulation. Dr. Newman, how common are these kinds of attacks on older patients? Are there other people dealing with family members who use medical providers to build false cases of incompetence? Her response was sobering. Unfortunately, it's more common than most people realize. Elder abuse often involves family members who manipulate healthcare providers, financial institutions, and legal systems to gain control over an older person's assets. You were fortunate to have the resources and knowledge to fight back, but many victims don't. This conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually reshape my plans for the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. Instead of focusing solely on educational scholarships, I began to consider how the foundation might also support legal advocacy for elderly victims of financial abuse and manipulation. The criminal case against Victoria moved forward quickly, due to the overwhelming evidence Maria Santos and I had compiled. District Attorney James Morrison assigned prosecutor Catherine Walsh to handle the case, and she contacted me within a week of Victoria's arrest. Mrs. Whitmore, this is one of the most well-documented elder abuse cases our office has ever seen, Prosecutor Walsh told me during our initial meeting. Your foresight in installing security cameras and documenting every incident has provided us with an exceptionally strong case. Prosecutor Walsh explained that Victoria was facing multiple felony charges that could result in a prison sentence of up to 15 years. The charges included criminal trespass, attempted witness tampering, filing false police reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse under the state's enhanced penalties for crimes against vulnerable adults. However, Walsh continued, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Victoria's defense attorney will attempt to portray this as a family dispute, rather than criminal behavior. They may argue that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for your welfare, despite the evidence to the contrary. This warning proved prescient when Victoria hired renowned criminal defense attorney Marcus Reed, who specialized in defending white-collar criminals and had a reputation for creating sympathetic narratives for unsympathetic clients. Reed's strategy became clear when he held a press conference outside the courthouse, presenting Victoria as a devoted daughter-in-law who had been criminally prosecuted for trying to protect an elderly family member from making dangerous decisions. My client, Victoria Hayes, is a loving mother and devoted family member who became concerned when she observed signs that her mother-in-law might be experiencing cognitive decline, Reed told the assembled reporters. Her attempts to seek help for Mrs. Whitmore have been twisted into criminal charges by prosecutors who don't understand the complexity of family dynamics when dealing with aging relatives. Reed went on to suggest that I had manipulated the legal system to retaliate against Victoria for expressing legitimate concerns about my mental capacity. He characterized the security cameras in my home as evidence of paranoid behavior and suggested that my criminal complaints were the result of confusion and anger, rather than rational decision-making. The press conference was a masterful piece of manipulation that reframed Victoria's criminal behavior as family concern and portrayed me as the real problem in the situation. Reed was essentially arguing that Victoria's crimes were justified by her perception of my incompetence. Despite the complete lack of evidence supporting that perception, I watched the press conference with a mixture of anger and admiration for Reed's skill in creating alternative narratives. But I also recognized that this was exactly the kind of manipulation that had allowed Victoria to operate for so long without being challenged. David Chen advised me not to respond publicly to Reed's press conference, arguing that engaging in a media battle would only provide more opportunities for Victoria's defense team to muddy the waters. Mrs. Whitmore, the criminal case will be decided based on evidence, not public relations, David reminded me. We have overwhelming proof of Victoria's criminal behavior, and her attorney's media strategy won't change those facts. But Reed's press conference had achieved its intended effect of generating public sympathy for Victoria and casting doubt on the legitimacy of the criminal charges. Several local media outlets ran follow-up stories exploring the complex ethical issues involved in family disputes over elderly relatives' capacity and autonomy. One particularly troubling article in the Hartford Courant suggested that criminalizing family members' efforts to protect elderly relatives might discourage people from intervening when intervention was genuinely needed. The article quoted several experts on eldercare who argued that Victoria's behavior, while perhaps misguided, might have been motivated by legitimate concerns. Reading these articles, I realized that Victoria and her attorney were tapping into deeper societal anxieties about aging, family responsibility, and the rights of elderly people to make their own decisions. Many people genuinely believed that adult children had both the right and the obligation to override their elderly parents' autonomy when they perceived potential risks or poor judgment. This realization led me to make a decision that would significantly expand the scope of my response to Victoria's manipulation. Instead of simply defending myself in the criminal case, I decided to use this situation as a platform to advocate for the rights of elderly people to maintain their autonomy and to educate the public about the difference between legitimate concern and criminal manipulation. I contacted Jennifer Martinez, a respected journalist who specialized in investigative reporting on elder abuse and social justice issues. Jennifer had covered several high-profile cases involving financial exploitation of elderly individuals, and I believed she would understand the broader implications of Victoria's behavior. Mrs. Whitmore, your case represents a perfect example of how ageism and ableism intersect to make elderly people vulnerable to manipulation, Jennifer said during our first interview. The assumption that age and hearing loss automatically equal incompetence is exactly what allowed Victoria to build her campaign against you. Jennifer's subsequent article in the New York Times provided a comprehensive analysis of my case, within the broader context of elder abuse and discrimination against people with disabilities. The article explained how Victoria's initial complaints about my hearing aid had been part of a systematic effort to portray normal aging and disability accommodation as evidence of incompetence. The Times article generated significant national attention and sparked a broader conversation about the rights of elderly people to live independently and make their own decisions. I received letters and emails from hundreds of people who had faced similar manipulation from family members or who worked with elderly clients dealing with these issues. One letter that particularly moved me came from Dr. Susan Chen, a geriatrician in California who had been following my case. Mrs. Whitmore, your willingness to fight back against this manipulation has inspired many of my patients who have faced similar situations, Dr. Chen wrote. Too often elderly people surrender their autonomy because they've been convinced that resistance is selfish or dangerous. Your case demonstrates that age and disability don't automatically disqualify someone from making their own decisions. The national attention also brought me into contact with advocacy organizations working on behalf of elderly people and people with disabilities. The National Association of Area Agencies on Aging invited me to speak at their annual conference about my experience and the lessons it offered for protecting elderly people from financial abuse. Preparing for this speaking engagement forced me to think more deeply about the systemic issues that had enabled Victoria's manipulation campaign. While my case had received attention because of my wealth and prominence, I knew that thousands of elderly people faced similar attacks without the resources to defend themselves effectively. The conference presentation became the foundation for what would eventually become the Whitmore Center for Elder Justice, a legal advocacy organization focused specifically on protecting elderly people from financial manipulation and guardianship abuse. But first, I had to navigate the continued challenges posed by Victoria's criminal trial and the ongoing effects of her manipulation campaign on my family relationships. Robert had filed for divorce from Victoria immediately after her arrest, but the legal proceedings were complicated by questions about their shared assets and custody arrangements for their children. Victoria's criminal behavior had created a web of legal and financial issues that would take months or even years to fully resolve. More troubling was the impact of these events on my grandchildren. Emma and Sophie, aged 8 and 10, were struggling to understand why their Aunt Victoria was in jail and why their family was suddenly involved in court cases and media coverage. Sarah, Michael's wife, had taken on the difficult task of helping the girls process these events while protecting them from the more disturbing details of Victoria's manipulation campaign. Eleanor, they keep asking if you're really sick and if Aunt Victoria was trying to help you, Sarah told me during one of our conversations. It's so hard to explain to children that someone they trusted was doing bad things while pretending to be helpful. I realized that Victoria's manipulation had not only targeted me, but had also affected innocent children who had been exposed to her lies and deception. This added another layer of damage that would need to be addressed as our family worked to heal from this traumatic experience. The preliminary hearing for Victoria's criminal case was scheduled for late October, about 6 weeks after her arrest. This hearing would determine whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, though given the overwhelming documentation we had compiled, there was little doubt about the outcome. Prosecutor Walsh prepared me for what to expect during the hearing, including the likelihood that Victoria's defense attorney would attempt to cross-examine me aggressively in hopes of demonstrating some evidence of cognitive impairment or confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus Reed is going to try to make you appear confused, forgetful, or easily rattled during your testimony," Walsh warned. "His goal will be to create doubt about your competence, even though competence isn't actually relevant to whether Victoria committed the crimes she's charged with." I appreciated the warning, but I felt confident in my ability to handle Reed's questioning. After decades of legal practice and business leadership, I was well prepared for adversarial examination, and I had the advantage of knowing that everything I would testify about was completely true and well documented. The preliminary hearing took place in a packed courtroom, with media representatives, family members, and curious observers filling every available seat. Victoria appeared with her attorney, dressed in a modest gray dress and looking appropriately remorseful, though I suspected this was another calculated performance. Prosecutor Walsh presented the evidence systematically and thoroughly, walking through each of Victoria's criminal acts with supporting documentation and witness testimony. The security camera footage was particularly powerful, showing Victoria's unauthorized entries into my home and her deliberate staging of evidence to support her claims about my mental state. Mrs. Garcia's testimony about Victoria's attempted bribery was clear and compelling, and Detective Mitchell's explanation of the investigation findings provided professional confirmation of the criminal nature of Victoria's behavior. When Marcus Reed began his cross-examination of me, his strategy became immediately apparent. Rather than challenging the facts of Victoria's criminal acts, he was attempting to suggest that those acts had been motivated by reasonable concerns about my capacity. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that you've experienced some hearing difficulties in recent years?" Reed began, his tone respectful but pointed. "Yes, I have age-related hearing loss, which is why I use a hearing aid," I replied calmly. "And doesn't this hearing loss sometimes make it difficult for you to follow conversations or participate in meetings?" "Not when my hearing aid is properly adjusted, which it always is." Reed continued this line of questioning for several minutes, clearly hoping I would become confused or defensive. Instead, I answered each question directly and factually, occasionally adjusting my hearing aid to ensure I could hear his questions clearly. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've testified that you installed security cameras in your home. Isn't this kind of surveillance unusual for someone your age living alone?" This question revealed Reed's strategy of portraying normal security precautions as evidence of paranoia or incompetence. "Mr. Reed, installing security systems is a standard safety precaution for anyone living alone, regardless of age. In my case, it proved to be an excellent decision since it documented your client's criminal trespassing and evidence tampering." Reed's cross-examination continued for over an hour, but he was unable to shake my testimony or create any appearance of confusion or incompetence. If anything, my calm, detailed responses to his questions demonstrated exactly the kind of mental clarity that contradicted Victoria's claims about my cognitive state. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Hendricks ruling that there was abundant probable cause to believe that Victoria had committed the charged crimes, and that the case should proceed to trial. Outside the courthouse, Reed held another press conference in which he argued that the criminal charges were inappropriate, and that the case should be handled as a civil family matter rather than a criminal prosecution. This case criminalizes family concern and sets a dangerous precedent for adult children who are genuinely worried about elderly parents, Reed told the media. Mrs. Hayes's actions may have been misguided, but they were motivated by love and concern, not criminal intent. Prosecutor Walsh responded with her own statement, emphasizing that the evidence clearly showed criminal behavior motivated by greed rather than genuine concern. Victoria Hayes systematically engaged in criminal trespassing, witness tampering, and fraud in an attempt to gain control over Mrs. Whitmore's assets, Walsh stated. These are not the actions of someone motivated by concern for an elderly relative's welfare. The media coverage following the preliminary hearing was more balanced than Reed's initial press conferences, with several articles noting the strength of the evidence against Victoria and the questionable nature of her defense strategy. But the more important development came when I was contacted by attorneys representing other elderly individuals who had faced similar manipulation campaigns from family members, seeking to gain control over their assets. Attorney Lisa Park from the Elder Justice Project in Boston reached out to discuss the possibility of filing a civil lawsuit against Victoria that would go beyond the criminal charges to seek damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm her campaign had caused. Mrs. Whitmore, your case could set an important legal precedent for holding family members accountable for elder abuse that goes beyond simple financial theft, Park explained. A successful civil suit could provide a model for other elderly victims to seek justice and compensation for similar manipulation. The idea of a civil lawsuit was appealing not just for the potential financial recovery, but for the opportunity to establish legal precedents that might protect other elderly people from similar abuse. I decided to pursue both the civil case and my plans for the Whitmore Center for Elder Justice, using my experience as a platform for broader advocacy and reform. The civil lawsuit was filed in November, seeking damages for emotional distress, defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional harm. The suit also included claims under Connecticut's elder abuse statutes, which provided for enhanced damages when elderly individuals were targeted for financial manipulation. Victoria's response to the civil suit was predictably defensive, with Marcus Reed arguing that the lawsuit was vindictive and designed to punish his client for expressing legitimate family concerns. But the civil discovery process would provide opportunities to explore aspects of Victoria's manipulation campaign that hadn't been fully developed in the criminal case. We would be able to examine her financial records, communications, and relationships with other family members in much greater detail. More importantly, the civil case would allow us to document the full scope of damage that Victoria's manipulation had caused, not just to me personally, but to family relationships and community trust that would take years to rebuild. As winter approached, I found myself busier than I had been at any point since Charles's death. Managing the criminal and civil cases, developing plans for the Whitmore Center for Elder Justice, and continuing to run Whitmore Industries required careful coordination and tremendous energy. But I also found the work deeply fulfilling in ways that surprised me. Victoria's attack on my autonomy and competence had forced me to articulate and defend values I had always held but never had to express so explicitly. The process of fighting back had clarified my understanding of what it meant to age with dignity and maintain independence in the face of societal expectations and family pressures. The speaking engagements and advocacy work had also connected me with a community of people working on these issues professionally and personally. I was learning about legal reforms, social services, and advocacy strategies that could make a real difference in protecting elderly people from the kind of manipulation I had experienced. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the neuropsychologist who had evaluated my mental competence, contacted me about collaborating on research into the intersection of disability and elder abuse. Mrs. Whitmore, your case highlights how assistive devices like hearing aids can be weaponized against elderly people by family members seeking to establish incompetence, Dr. Harper explained. We'd like to study this phenomenon more systematically and develop better tools for distinguishing between legitimate capacity concerns and manipulative campaigns. This research project became another component of what was evolving into a comprehensive response to Victoria's manipulation that went far beyond simply defending myself in court. By December, the scope of my advocacy work had grown to include testimony before state legislative committees considering reforms to guardianship laws, consultation with law enforcement agencies developing better protocols for investigating elder abuse, and collaboration with medical professionals working to prevent the manipulation of healthcare records. The irony was not lost on me that Victoria's campaign to portray me as a confused elderly woman had resulted in my becoming more publicly active and professionally engaged than I had been at any point since Charles's death. The criminal trial was scheduled for February, which would provide a definitive resolution to the most serious charges against Victoria. But regardless of the trial's outcome, the broader conversation about elder rights and family manipulation would continue. Victoria had complained that my hearing aid was too loud, never realizing that it was allowing me to hear not just her deceptions, but also the voices of countless other elderly people who had faced similar challenges. Her manipulation campaign had inadvertently created a platform for me to advocate for issues that affected thousands of people who lacked the resources or visibility to fight back effectively. As I prepared for the challenges ahead, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that first family dinner when Victoria had asked me to turn down my hearing aid. What had seemed like a minor accommodation request had revealed itself as the beginning of a systematic attack on my autonomy and dignity. But Victoria's attack had also revealed strengths and purposes I hadn't fully recognized in myself. The experience of defending my right to control my own life had connected me with a larger cause that would outlive any individual legal case or family conflict. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation would still provide educational scholarships, but it would also fund legal advocacy, policy reform, and research aimed at protecting elderly people from financial manipulation and guardianship abuse. The Whitmore Center for Elder Justice would serve as a resource for elderly individuals facing challenges to their autonomy, and for family members genuinely concerned about elderly relatives' welfare. Most importantly, my willingness to fight back against Victoria's manipulation would serve as an example for other elderly people who might be tempted to surrender their independence rather than confront family members engaging in similar behavior. Victoria had assumed that age and disability would make me vulnerable to her manipulation, but she had underestimated the power that comes from experience, resources, and absolute determination to protect what matters most. Her greatest mistake had been believing that someone who had spent decades fighting for justice would simply surrender when the fight came to their own doorstep. As winters settled over Connecticut, I looked ahead to the trials and advocacy work that would define the next phase of my life. Victoria's manipulation campaign was ending, but the broader fight for elder rights and dignity was just beginning. My hearing aid would continue to help me hear clearly, not just in conversations and meetings, but in the voices of people who needed advocates and the opportunities for meaningful change that lay ahead. The foundation I had built with Charles would support not just our family's future, but also the futures of elderly people who deserve to live with autonomy, dignity, and protection from those who would exploit their age or disabilities for personal gain. Victoria's complaint about my hearing aid had ultimately led to something she never could have anticipated: a powerful platform for defending the rights of people exactly like me. Victoria received 12 years in federal prison. The judge called her crimes a calculated assault on elderly dignity. Robert rebuilt our relationship slowly. Sarah and the grandchildren visit weekly now. Michael manages company operations while I focus on advocacy. The Whitmore Center has prevented 43 guardianship abuse cases. We've trained law enforcement across 6 states to recognize elder manipulation. My hearing aid still works perfectly. I adjust the volume confidently during board meetings, knowing no one questions my competence anymore. The Foundation's scholarship recipients send thank you letters. One wrote that education freed her from poverty, just as justice freed me from manipulation. At 75, I'm busier than ever. Yesterday's testimony before Congress about guardianship reform felt like closing arguments in my most important case. Victoria underestimated a woman who built an empire from nothing. She forgot that experience teaches lessons manipulation cannot touch. My legacy isn't the money I leave behind. It's proving that age and disability are strengths, not vulnerabilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.